Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this LinkedIn Live about cross-border M&A negotiations. Learning never stops. So thank you for being there, even in the middle of the summer, or maybe you're watching this video, the recorded version of this event. So both the live and the recorded participants, a warm welcome to you all for this event. Now, I have with me Yadvinder Rana, and we will get to know him in a moment. But before we find out more about our special guest for today, how about learning more about our audience? The topic of cross-border M&A negotiation may be appealing to a quite a diverse audience. So let's get an idea about who is with us today. So how about dropping us a quick comment? StreamYard, on the bottom right side of your screen, you have a comment box, and you can tell us maybe from where you're connecting, just so that we get an idea about who are the person that decided to join us in this probably warm day. At least this is the case in Switzerland. So let's see if we have also uh, other participants joining us from different places. Here we go. And tell us a few words about where you're connecting from. All right, we have Alfredo. Buenos dias, Alfredo, waking up early in the morning, ready to go from Philadelphia. And then we have a user from Switzerland, from the first part speaking of Switzerland, two person, two different continents. Let's see who is the first participant. Oh, okay, here we are. Hello, Giuseppe and Yadvinder. Hello, Ivan. Good to see you again. Quite a long time since our Gallen workshop. I hope you're doing great. And let's see who else is with us today. And by the way, as we get more people, yes, joining us from different places. Okay. Stefano is in Gallipoli. I wonder whether you are really working hard over there, Stefano, or you're just enjoying the beach. And Gallipoli is in Puglia, in the south of Italy, just if you're not familiar, quite a popular place during the summer. Then we have also Diana connecting from Slovakia. Hello. And here we have the third continent. Yes, we have Jake joining us from Nairobi. Fantastic. Okay, that's already quite a variety of participants. Thank you very much for being with us. How about finding out more now about our speaker?
Hello,
Yadvinder,
Giuseppe.
tell us a bit more about yourself.
Hello, Giuseppe. First of all, thanks for having me. It's wonderful. I am a professor of cross-cultural negotiation at the Catholic University Milan, and previously I was in the corporate world. I was a manager in international M&As and also as a sales director in Asia. So I traveled a bit. I worked in different places around the world until, for family reasons, my wife asked me to stop traveling. And now, as you can see, I'm in Milano. So that's where I'm talking from. And my curiosity is all about complex negotiations. As for you, Giuseppe.
Okay, fantastic, fantastic. Just another small curiosity before we go into the topic. Italian wife?
Italian wife,
Italian wife.
Indian parents, mixed kids.
Okay, amazing, perfect. And let's get started. By the way, this is your LinkedIn Live event. I have plenty of questions that I can ask to Yadvinder, but you may have your own. So don't hesitate to ask questions so that you get the most from being able to join live this event. Okay, let me get started. I mean, I'm curious to understand what is the motivation for exploring cross-border M&A negotiations?
Studying M&As in general, we all know that most M&As fail. According to latest research, the number is between 50 and 60%. And what is interesting is that among the three main reasons for M&A failures, we can find overvaluated synergies, post-merger integration didn't work, but especially an ineffective management of the negotiation process. But while the other stages of M&As has been fully explored, we can't find many articles, academic journals on M&A negotiations. It's treated like a black box. So that was why the main reason why I started my research on this specific topic.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Okay. And you focus on M&A. I mean, but how do complex negotiations such as cross-border M&A ones differ from conventional negotiation? Buyer and seller kind of situation.
I think all the negotiations we are involved, especially the audience and us, are complex in some way because they involve multiple players. Even though we have only a buyer, a seller, the seller has in some way to negotiate inside its own company. And maybe the buying company has a decision-making process that involves many players. So all the negotiations are complex in some way. And M&A is just a sub-element of these complex negotiations. Regarding cross-border M&A negotiations, what is interesting is that there are multiple players, multiple issues, but especially in an age where we are talking about stakeholder capitalism, it's becoming even more important. We have to take care of society, of employees, not only of shareholders, but of all stakeholders. So multiple players are involved, and that renders the negotiation even more complex. Just to give you an example, one of the cases of studies was the failed negotiation between FCA and Renault in 2020. And 8 players were involved. We had also Nissan, that is partner of Renault. We had 3 governments, the French one, the Italian one, the Japanese one, the unions involved. So if you look at it from a mathematical perspective, 8 players lead to 40,000 possible mathematical combinations. The degrees of freedom explode. So this is why complex negotiations are important.
Wow. Yeah, amazing. Very interesting. Okay, and in all this complexity, I mean, what kind of common patterns did you find? What are, maybe some main outcomes of your research? If there is something that you found in all of this mess, let's see.
We try to reduce the complexity. And to reduce the complexity, first of all, you have to identify all the players. This is very, very important. You can't miss a player because they can have a veto power, they can influence other players. And then you have also to understand their main interests. This is fundamental. And how do you reduce the complexity? You build coalitions. For example, in cross-border M&A negotiations, coalitions with the unions and coalitions with governments are fundamental. If you don't have the support of the unions, you can't find a durable agreement. I'll just give you an example. If you remember in 2009, Sergio Marchionne, at the time was the CEO of Fiat, was discussing the acquisition of Chrysler. But at the same time, he was also discussing with GM the acquisition of Opel. And one question that always comes to my mind is why he was successful in acquiring Chrysler, but he was not successful at all in acquiring Opel. Why the negotiations with GM for Opel failed? One of the main reasons is that in Germany, he didn't involve the Works Council of Opel, the unions that are very, very relevant. They're part of the board, as you know better than me. And especially in election time, as it was in 2009, their role was fundamental. And Angela Merkel had to take into account their opinion. And Marchionne completely disregarded them. And that led to his failed bid for Opel. So understanding the role of different players, their interests, and building coalitions becomes fundamental when you have complex negotiations. You can't negotiate with everybody. You have to build coalitions. This is very important. This is something we also learn in politics, if you think of it.
Mm-hmm. No, yeah, we can comment about the politics and the situation also that we are going through in Italy, but maybe let's stay away from that. But I wanna focus on one element. It seems that we are not so good in learning from the past, because you mentioned the example of Fiat trying to acquire Opel, but I can bring you a bit of an older example. I have a gray hair, so I was there a bit earlier, and when Pirelli tried to acquire Continental in Germany. So, again, an Italian company tried to acquire a German one. One of the mistakes they made at the time, it was a failed acquisition, which costed the Pirelli a substantial amount of money, was that they didn't involve the unions. And the other mistake that they did is that they got the support from the government at a national level, but not at regional level, which also something that is important in the German way of working. So, you can see, even if the literature had already identified some of the mistakes, then somehow, we forget them. So it's good that we have experts like you that are there, trying to go through those things and capture again, some of the mistakes that we want to avoid in order to be more effective in cross-border negotiation.
And Giuseppe,
Fantastic.
Adding to what you were saying, one of the findings we research, and I think it's also common sense, is that hostile takeovers or a very competitive mindset doesn't work in mergers and acquisitions. Why? Because you need to have an integrative mindset. And most of the negotiation in this area involve very competitive, sometimes, acquirers. And that doesn't work, doesn't render the negotiation very durable. So this is one of the other findings we found. That is common sense, but still are some of the mistakes we make.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting.
Please.
Maybe, I think, yeah, you mentioned a finding that may sound, common sense, but maybe which finding surprised you? Because they seem counterintuitive.
There are three things that, if I may, one of the findings was one of the most important predictors of success in M&A negotiation is the relationship between the two CEOs. It's not only trust, but it's a very specific trust. It's affective trust. They have to like each other. Otherwise, it becomes very, very hard. One of the other reasons why Marchionne was not able to buy Opel was his very sketchy relationship with, at the time, CEO of General Motors, Frederick Henderson. They didn't like each other. And that was another factor that affected the negotiation. So trust between the many negotiators is fundamental. Another point is, even in the presence of power asymmetries, we have to have equality provisions in the negotiation. It means that we can't have control of all the board, we can't have all our managers on the top, we have to have equality. And there is also a very rational idea behind that. If we want to achieve the synergies, we need other party, even if it's smaller than us. Otherwise, we can't achieve the synergies. So having provisions of equality is fundamental. It's another predictor of the durability of M&As. But most importantly, most studies on international business negotiations are based on cultural differences. Interestingly, in my research, cultural differences don't affect the negotiations. There is no influence by cultural differences on the negotiations. And one of the reasons is that when you have experienced negotiators, the impact of culture is much lower. Experience moderates the impact of cultural differences between the main negotiators. So it is quite interesting to see what is common practice and what we focus on, and sometimes we disregard other factors that are much more important.
Interesting. Yeah, that's very interesting find. By the way, I remind you that you can ask all the questions that you want. So, if you want to find out some more about M&A, about culture, etc., do take the opportunity to ask the questions that you want. In the meantime, as we wait if somebody has some question before I go on, I want to tell you about our next two events. We have two more events, and they are quite different from each other. So, they may attract a different type of audience. The next one is on the 25th of August. So, in about 1 month at 1 o'clock, how procurement helped me to thrive in innovation. How procurement helped me to thrive in innovation. The link is available on the chat. So if you want to sign up, 25th of August, 1 o'clock, and join me with a former chief procurement officer, a former head of innovation, to understand how procurement and innovation connect with each other. The next one is on the 1st of September. And this time we will be talking about effective communication with healthcare regulators. 1st of September at 1 o'clock, effective communication with healthcare regulators. So if you work in regulatory affairs, in quality, in R&D, whatever, and you want to understand a bit more about how to influence and persuade in the most effective way in the healthcare sector, then don't hesitate to join us on the 1st of September at 1 o'clock. We will be talking again with the former Vice President of Regulatory Affairs and Quality, and we will be sharing some real life story about what is happening in those situations. Okay, fantastic. Let's move on. Let's go back to Yadvinder. And next question, you mentioned, some counterintuitive finding. Now, maybe we talked until now about M&A negotiations, but a number of the people in our audience may be working maybe in more traditional type of negotiation, buyer and seller. I mean, how can the finding from the research be employed also by buyer or sellers involved in complex international negotiations?
This is an interesting question, Giuseppe. I've been involved in both parts, as a buyer and as a seller. And for example, as a seller, most of my work was not negotiating with clients, was negotiating with inside organization. As I was saying at the beginning, this renders negotiation complex. Many players. You have the logistics, you have design, you have production, manufacturing. On the other side, if you're a buyer, again, you have other relevant stakeholders. Think of the quality, think of manufacturing, think of other people involved. Then as a seller, you have to understand the company you're selling to, and they have a decision-making process that is usually quite complex, again, involving many players. You have the technician, you have the user, you have the quality. So I would say that most negotiations we are involved in are complex. I think the findings can be applied there, understanding the relationship between different players and how each one of them can influence the others, which are their main interests, and how can you address the interests, and how can you build coalitions. It is very, very, very important. I think one way that as a researcher we can work with practitioners is maybe unfolding different scenarios, different future scenarios according to events, actions, or behaviors that we can take. So we have different alternative futures that we can dig in and that we can understand. And maybe we can also understand how to shape the negotiation towards the desired agreement, which coalitions to build, which equality provision to bring, how to build trust with other party. So it becomes very, very important. I think all the findings we find in these mega cross-border M&A negotiations can be applied to our everyday negotiations. All the negotiations are complex and have some level of complexity. If they're not multi-player, they're multi-issue. So I think understanding the complexity is very, very important. Take into account the complexity is fundamental.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now I'm thinking when I think about the buyer-seller negotiation, for instance, and those multiplayer kind of situation, maybe an example that resonate with people is, let's say that SAP or Oracle's is trying to sell an ERP system to your company. The way those company will make the sales, they will be dealing indeed with so many different players. There is the CEO, the CFO, the CIO, the CPO, the guy in charge of the IT, the manager of IT, the manager of procurement, etc. And a skilled salesperson will understand the interests and priorities of all those different stakeholders, so that, okay, they want to try to sell one idea, well, this one is going to like to the CFO. They want to try to sell different kind of ideas, well, maybe what we do, we first talk with the manager and he's going to sell it to his own director, etc., so that they look at those different stakeholders and try to find a way to make it work, so that they maximize the opportunity of success of their idea. By the way, Yadvinder, do you want to say something more about, is there some learning more about managing internal and external negotiation? Let's say,
going back 1 second to what you're saying about SAP selling a complex solution, one piece of advice I give is always to draw down a map of the different players and draw also the relationship between them. It is very interesting because what you find is the influence and the level of influence they have in the process, and also the relationship between the different players. Regarding internal and external negotiations, I always say that external negotiation is much easier because in internal negotiation, they know you better, no? I think 2 aspects and 2 factors become more relevant in internal negotiation. One is your own credibility, how you are perceived by the other person. Think of your skills, competence, knowledge, experience, and reliability, integrity as a person. And the other one is relationship, again, between the two, yourself and the person you're trying to influence. And you are a professor of influencing people. So relationships are fundamental. And if you think of the research findings that talk about effective trust between the CEOs, it becomes even more important maybe in influencing colleagues in internal negotiations. But I think these findings can also be brought outside. Your own credibility as a person becomes a very relevant factor. Your communication is really affected by your credibility, how the other person perceives you as a seller or as a buyer. On the other side, relationships is always important. There is always this big dilemma in negotiation between reaching your objectives and preserving the relationship, or maybe developing the relationship. I think master negotiators are always the ones that have this balance between the two. And relationship is very, very important. Sometimes underrated, but most of the times is fundamental.
Yeah, fantastic. By the way, we do have a question here from Sergio that just links very much to what you were discussing, the relationship piece. Now, if you understand the CEO don't like one another, what will you suggest them?
I think you should bring Giuseppe in the relationship. No, I think maybe you have to find some mediator between the two. Or maybe in some way you should plan the negotiations so that the CEO you're advising is able to better relate with other party. Even asking sorry for previous misunderstandings, for things that didn't work, I think it works very well. So, you have to be humble. If your objective in an M&A negotiation is to find and to achieve a durable integration between the two companies, you have to be humble, and the relationship is fundamental. So you have to do everything you can to find the relationship, find common ground between the two. You have to find a mediator, maybe. It can be an advisor, it can be somebody from the two companies, it can be a mediator, but somebody that tries to establish this relationship is fundamental.
Mm-hmm. Okay, fantastic. Now, to conclude, I mean, we are about reaching the end of our event. Maybe to conclude, let me dig a bit further into the cultural element. You just mentioned that surprisingly, culture is not one of the key elements of failure for those things. Although, we have read in the past that, maybe probably this was happening much more in the past, right? That will make things difficult. The cultural element will make things different. There is an example that comes into my mind. For instance, when Renault and Volvo made a joint venture around the truck business, the cultural connection was difficult. In fact, if you look at France and Sweden on the key cultural dimension, the differences are quite sharp. And in fact, the collaboration was not working so well between the two groups. One, for instance, was about the approach to hierarchy. French culture, much more hierarchical. They were sending to the international meetings the director because, it's an international meeting, we need somebody who's senior. On the other side, the Swedish, very egalitarian type of culture, they were sending to the meeting the manager because they know the details and they know what they're talking about. And then, of course, when they met each other, the French were frustrated because the Swedish was sending junior people, and the Swedish were frustrated because the people they were talking, they were not able to make much of a discussion because they didn't know the details. So I was just wondering if there is something about culture that you spotted, and if there is any advice you want to give to our audience.
Giuseppe, sometimes I get carried out from this cultural thing, cultural issue. I would like to state it better. In the negotiations, cultural difference don't affect the negotiation outcome. Because if you have the two CEOs, the two CFOs involved, usually they're experienced. But for sure, during the integration, when they have to work together, two companies, then culture highly affects. The experience you were mentioning between Volvo and Renault is something I experienced myself between Renault Véhicule Industriel and Iveco. It's a Fiat company for the bus company called Irisbus. So there were a lot of differences, even between France and Italy. So I completely agree. Culture, not only a national culture, but even company culture is fundamental to be addressed during the post-merger integration. So cultural differences don't affect the negotiation outcome, but culture is very important in the post-merger integration. And I think this is something you have to plan ahead of for classes. One of the ways some mergers plan for the cultural differences is having these cross-company teams working together during due diligence, for example. So you have cross-company teams working together. They start knowing each other. They know their cultural difference, but they also build a personal relationship that overcomes the cultural barriers. And this is a very good way. And then there is a training always. And I don't think that in a merger, one of the two cultures should overtake the other one. You have to find a common ground. It's very, very important. Very, very important. Usually when you have a merger, there is always one culture overtaking the other, and that becomes very hard to digest for the target company usually. So I think when we talk about the provisions of equality, we also have to talk about culture. We have to find a common ground. You have to find a common ground. This is very important. And maybe build a new culture, new organizational culture. Why not?
Yeah. Fantastic. Yadvinder, thank you very much. Very pragmatic advice, very down to earth, based on research, real life examples. So thank you very much for being with us today and for sharing the finding of research, your knowledge and wisdom. And thank you for the participants to this event, both the ones live and the one that watched the recording. And we look forward to reconnect with you for our two next LinkedIn Live event. Let me quickly remind them to you. Next one, 25th of August. If you are interested in procurement or innovation, how procurement helped me to thrive in innovation. and we'll look at somebody that moved from chief procurement officer to head of innovation. Second event, 1st of September at 1 o'clock, is about effective communication with healthcare regulators. So if you work in quality, regulatory affairs, R&D, or other kind of technical function in healthcare, you may very much enjoy to listen from a VP of Regulatory Affairs and Quality talking about his experience negotiating and influencing effectively with regulators. So thanks again, Yadvinder, for being with us, and look forward to seeing all of you again soon, and a great summer to all of you. If you didn't go on vacation yet, then please have a great vacation.
Thank you, Giuseppe.
Thanks again. All the very best. Bye-bye.